Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So we've previously looked at the 1796 pattern Light Cavalry Trooper's Sabre, the iconic British sword used during the Napoleonic period and indeed beyond, and revived again in use in the middle of the 19th century for use by Indian soldiers, and in fact the blade was mounted on Indian tulwars as well. It's a very iconic sword. Companies like Cold Steel have helped to continue to make it famous even today in replica form. And just to say a little bit more about that model of sword. So first up, as mentioned in my previous video, it was a design of sword essentially made by John Gaspard Le Marchant, who was a cavalry commander of the Napoleonic Wars, in conjunction with Henry Osborne. Now, Henry Osborne was a sword maker. It just so happens that the sword I'm holding here, which I'll be selling fairly soon on my website, is an Osborne made. It's marked on the spine of the blade, so most of the makers' names are, if you look at the blunt, what we call the spine, the back of the base of the blade there, you won't be able to see on camera, but it just says Osborne at the base there. So this is actually an example of a Henry Osborne made sabre of the Napoleonic Wars, and it's been well service sharpened and has probably seen some interesting things. It's missing its scabbard unfortunately, but nevertheless it's a nice sabre. Now what's different about this compared to the one that I showed before is that this is not a what I would call trooper's sabre, this is an officer's sabre. Well, first of all, for those of you who don't know, an officer in this period in the British Army is a commissioned rank. So a normal person joining the army would join as a private soldier, and if you went into a cavalry regiment you would be known as a trooper. So private in the infantry, gunner in the artillery, seaman in the navy, and trooper in the cavalry. Now a cavalry trooper, so a basic cavalry trooper of the light cavalry, would carry the standard, in the Napoleonic period, the standard 1796 pattern light cavalry sabre. However, if you were a commissioned officer, and most commissioned officers paid for their ranks, they went in usually at ensign level, shall we say, and or cornet in the cavalry, and then fairly quickly progressed up to second lieutenant, and then lieutenant, and then captain, and then major eventually if they stayed in the army for long enough. They actually paid for their initial commission. So to be commissioned into the British Army you had to pay for it. And in actual fact, one of the misconceptions certainly in the modern mindset is that officers were always really rich. In actual fact, many of them weren't. A lot of them were sort of middle class, upper middle class, and they saw military rank as a way of progressing their own status in society. And in many cases they joined the army for a certain number of years with a view to it opening up career opportunities that they could then pursue after being in the army for, say, 5 or 6 years. So many officers who bought their commissions weren't necessarily intending to stay in the army for a long period of time. Some of them were only relatively short service. The Napoleonic Wars is a slightly different situation in that there was a patriotic sort of fervour as well about it. And let's be realistic, Napoleon did want to invade Britain. He had invaded the rest of Europe, and you know, it wasn't just, you know, not like in World War I where it was perhaps going off to fight the enemy of an ally in some people's kind of view. In the Napoleonic Wars there was a very real threat in the public mindset of invasion, so there was quite an upsurge in the number of people joining the army and the navy. Anyway, to come back to the main topic, this is the officer's version. Now, the officer's version of the 1796 light cavalry sabre, as you can see, essentially in shape, in silhouette, shall we say, is basically the same. However, there are some differences. The first difference to mention is, generally speaking, they're better made and lighter. Okay, so whereas the trooper's sword is usually about 2 pounds in weight, the officer's version is very often slightly less than that. Not very much, we're only talking a few ounces, but it makes a big difference in the hand. This example, and I won't say it's unusual in that, but this example is an example of a really light one. It is a really light sword, very nimble, very quick, and although it looks broad, it's actually very, very quick and nimble, and you can move it all over the place even in a small confined space as I'm in here, trying not to hit my light fitting. So it is a really, really light and nimble sword, especially when it's been well sharpened, because of course that reduces a bit of mass off the edge. And this is an Osborne-made example. There were different makers making them, various companies up and down the British Isles making these swords. They were private purchases, so an officer, when they bought their commission, they also had to buy all of their own equipment. Many people incorrectly, especially on the internet, refer to these officers' swords of any period, even the Victorian ones, as being issued. They were never issued. Officers' swords were private purchases, just like their underpants. Okay, they bought it themselves. An officer, certainly in the Georgian period, the Napoleonic era, but equally in the Victorian era, and even up until the Edwardian and First World War, bought all of their stuff. They bought their whole uniform, they bought their revolvers or their pistols, whichever period we're talking about, they bought their swords, they bought everything. They bought their horses, and very often the cost of being an officer was greater than the amount you got paid to be an officer. And in fact there are many examples of diaries where young officers are complaining about the cost. They even had to pay for their accommodation a lot of the time, and they complain about the cost of being an officer. So they had to come from a family who could afford to essentially support them, or they had to be independently wealthy themselves through some other means. And as I mentioned, it was something that they either wanted to do for their own personal sense of manhood or whatever, or a patriotic fervour, or indeed it was something that they saw as a kind of a stepping stone to moving up in society. Anyway, so the officers' versions look the same, but they are lighter, and they are, generally speaking, better made than the troopers' versions. They're private purchase, that's why they're better made, that's why they can be lighter. Troopers' weapons, or issued weapons, so the ones given to the private soldiers and the troopers, tend to be over-engineered a little bit. They tend to be bulkier than they need to be, because of course they're put in and out of regimental armouries all the time, and they have to put up with rougher use, and probably, it must be said, more use than most officers' weapons. So just like comparing a modern army rifle, it needs to be over-constructed a bit to put up with standard army use, whereas a target range rifle that's privately owned by some civilian doesn't need to be so robust, because they treat it with more care and it doesn't get thrown around a lot. So these tend to be better made, lighter, a little bit more fragile in some cases therefore, but even, you know, they've got slightly finer, thinner guards and this kind of thing. Now, the officers' versions also have some differences to the hilt. So if I just use this one as an example, you will notice it does not have the ears coming out of the side of the backstrap. So the trooper's sword has ears coming from the backstrap and a rivet going through the grip. This does not have it. That's not to say that all officers' swords don't have it, some do. However, when officers' swords have the ears coming on the side, they tend to be much more slender and sometimes very nicely shaped, sometimes ornate. Whereas the trooper's version, as you can Google the images of the 1796 sabre yourself, are just like a really basic fat D shape. The officers' ones, if they have those ears, are more finely shaped and smaller, and in fact, as I've shown here, many of the officers' ones do not have those ears through the side. The next thing is that the covering of the grip is very often different on an officer's sword compared to a trooper's sword. So the trooper's sword is just basic cord around and then covered in leather. So cord over wood and then leather over that. The officers' ones can come in a variety of different grip materials. This example is fairly common. It's shark skin, and of course shark skin was used on officers' swords right the way through to the Victorian period. But some officers' ones are leather, but then they have wire in the recesses made of something like silver or something like this, or indeed sometimes you get bone or ivory grips, or even ebony. So you get essentially a nicer quality, more fancy grip, as you'd expect of an officer's weapon. The back straps on the officer's swords tend to be plain on the cavalry versions. The infantry versions based on this are usually more ornate and sometimes have a lion head on the pommel. Some cavalry officers' swords have something on the pommel like a lion head, or leaves, like acanthus leaves or feathers, or these kind of ornate things. Usually they don't, however. Usually even the cavalry officer's backstrap is usually plain, however they're sometimes ornate. And lastly, the actual guard itself. So the guard, as you see, maintains the same shape as the trooper's weapon fundamentally, but it's finer and thinner, and it has bevels on it. It's just slightly finer quality, more nicely formed, and very often, you know, these languettes here have a very slight, you know, more of a bevel to them, and sometimes they have something ornate on the surface there. So there we go. They've maintained the essential look of the trooper's weapon, of the 1796 light cavalry trooper's sabre, but they've essentially just made it a bit nicer because it's private purchase, so however much money you can throw at it, you can make it more and more and more fancy. And there are some ludicrously fancy versions, for example the Lloyd's prize, Lloyd's as in Lloyd's Bank, Lloyd's prize swords that are ridiculously, they came in different values of thousands of pounds, which of course was a lot of money at the time, and they were prize swords given to people who'd done something impressive, and they come in, I believe, in naval forms and in cavalry forms, I believe. But they, you know, there's kind of no top end to how fancy these swords could be. What we see here is probably just a fairly bog standard junior officer's light cavalry sabre of the Napoleonic Wars. So this is a relatively common type. And the other thing to mention is decoration of the blade. So the other big area where we often see a difference between the officers' swords and the troopers' swords is the blades of the officers' swords are sometimes, and very often in fact, decorated. And again, that decoration depends on how much money you throw at the sword maker. It can be anything from a plain blade, so some officers' swords have plain blades, I think this probably had a plain blade. It can have a basically engraved blade, or it can have an etched and engraved blade, or it can have what's known as a blue and gilt blade. Now, bluing is a form of heating the steel so it goes blue, and you get this beautiful lustrous blue surface on it. It's used on gun barrels, it's used on antique clock hands, this kind of thing. It gives a beautiful rich blue colour, and sometimes they would add gilding to the decoration, so they would engrave the blade, then they would, I believe, then blue it, and then put gilding over the top of that. So you'd get this contrast, this beautiful contrast between the goldy yellow colour and then the deep blue colour. And then some of the blade would be brightly polished, mirror polished steel. So you get these beautifully contrasting colours on the blade. So that, like I say, there was really no upper end to how much money you could throw at an officer's sword in this period. It really just depended on how much money you had to spare. So there we go, there's a relatively brief overview, but I think I've covered all of the main points, looking at the differences between the officer's version of the light cavalry, British light cavalry sabre of the Napoleonic era, and we're talking about 1796 to 1821, 1822, here, they were in use, and the difference between the trooper's version and the officer's version. Essentially the officer's versions are just more fancy, generally better made, and a little bit prettier and ornate, but just as functional, and once they're sharpened up they're just as much of a lethal weapon as the trooper's version is. Cheers folks! Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook, you can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.